And I want to start off just mentioning the categories. I know that both of you have set up categories, but it's kind of easiest, and if you don't have all these figured out right now, it's fine. But if you kind of have an idea of all the categories that your grades are going to go into before you start building your grade center, it helps, because otherwise, a lot of times folks will go in and create a bunch of activities and tests and things, and then go in to build their grade center, and then they have to go back and build their categories, and then go back into all their activities and tests and put the right category in them. So if you can think through the types of categories that you're going to use, it makes it a little bit easier as you set up. So, and you probably noticed that the grade center has some default categories there. It's just a handful, and if you'll click into your grade center, one other thing you may not have noticed, but this little arrow to the right, if you just click on that, it will take you straight to the full grade center without having to click grade center and the full grade center. But either way, you get to the same spot with this.
Did not know that.
Just a little shortcut. Yeah, I didn't know it for a long time, and I clicked it one day. But that's a little quicker. And you won't see any students in your classes because they've not been put in yet, but you should still see the columns at the top. And so you have these sort of default columns, weighted total and total. Do you see something similar to what's on my screen?
Yes.
Without the students? Okay. And so to do the categories, it's under the Manage menu and Categories. So if you'll click on that, and you'll see the default categories that Blackboard gives you. And you can use these or not use them. And you probably have categories that these don't apply to. And some folks don't realize that you can make custom categories, and they try to fit them into those. But you can make custom categories just by clicking on the Create Category button at the top. Do both of you have a category that doesn't fit into what's there, or are those sufficient for what you have?
Tests or quizzes,
Yeah.
and then course assignments, and then final exam.
Okay. So so there's an assignment category there that you can use, and a test category. So you're good on those. Now with the final, if it's just one grade, so if it's one activity or one grade that counts a certain percentage, you can do a category, but since it's only one, it's kind of it's extra work to make a category, because you'll see when we set up the weights, you can just put one activity over to weight, so you could just
Okay, so some of the quizzes can
Yeah.
be 20%, the other one can be like 40%, is that what you're saying?
Well, no, I'm saying for your final exam, if it's only one grade, so you said you had a final exam that counts a certain percentage,
Right.
and it's just one grade, right?
Right.
So you don't really have to make a category for the final exam. You can just, when we set up the weights, and we'll look at this in a bit,
Okay.
when you move, you can just move over to one activity. You don't have, so that has the
Okay.
activities at the top, categories at the bottom, and you can just move over to the final, assign it 20%, whatever your percentage is, without it having to be in a category.
Right.
Now, to answer your other question, if you do have a category of quizzes, and within those quizzes, you wanted, like within that category, you wanted individual ones to weight more, we can do that. Okay, yeah, most people don't. I've
Just
run into
that final.
one person recently who does, but that's kind of, so say if you want to do that, we'll talk about that after.
No, it's complicated
Okay.
enough for that.
Yeah, most folks just keep them proportionally, or equal, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, within those categories, but you can change it up. Any questions where we are? Okay. Did you have a category outside of those?
Kind of like a final project.
Okay, and is it a one grade thing? So there again, unless you just want to have a category, I wouldn't make a category for it, because it's just extra work. The categories are really nice when you have multiple grades within that category. So, but just to walk through so you'll know, and it's obvious and straightforward, but there's a Create Category button at the top if you did want to make another category, and then you just give it a name. And I'm just gonna call it Custom, so you can see how it looks. So there's my category. It's pretty straightforward. All right, so once you have your categories kind of in place and know how you're going to be setting it up, then you need to start thinking about your activities. Now, in a fully online course, most of your activities are going to be done within Blackboard, and when you create those activities, whether it's an assignment or a test, Blackboard automatically creates the column in the Grade Center for you, which I'm sure you've experienced. So, but if you're teaching a face-to-face class, or you have some other grade that you're going to enter in manually, you can create manual columns in the Grade Center. So let's just go ahead and step through if we wanted to create a manual grade column. So this is, for instance, if you're in a hybrid or face-to-face class, you've assigned a paper that you're collecting and like physical copies of, and you're going to grade, and you want to enter in those grades manually, then you would do this. You would click the Create Column button, and then let's name it, it's going to call it Paper 1. And either of the courses that you ladies are thinking of that you have open, do you have manual assignments that you'll be entering in, or are they fully online?
I probably will.
Okay. Okay. So if you want to walk through as I do it and add it, you can, but if you want to wait until you have a better idea, that's fine too. So I'm going to call this Paper 1. The Grade Center name, that will just change what's at the top of the column in the Grade Center. Most folks don't bother with it. You don't have to bother with it unless you just want to. So the display, score, percentage. So you have a primary and secondary. So some folks do score where they give a certain number of points to certain activities. Some folks do a percentage out of 100. This is just kind of your personal preference, but just be sure to set what you want your primary display. So what that means is the Grade Center can show two different versions of the score. So if you wanted it to show points with a percentage outside of it, you could do points as a primary display, percentage as a secondary display. And so then it will show them like 600 points that they've accumulated, which translates to 95%. We show them both of them. So that's what the primary and secondary display are about. So, Donna, do you do points or percentages, or do you know? It's okay.
Actually, each of my quizzes are like a possibility of 50 points.
Okay.
And so they score,
Yeah, gotcha.
between 1 and 50.
Yeah.
Really never won, but.
Yeah. And how about you, Jennifer? Do you do points? Okay. And so what can happen if you do points, like you really do all points, that the points sometimes will actually do your weight for you if you're doing all points. But what a lot of folks will do is they'll call it points, but then they'll have it interpreted as percentages. Essentially, like if somebody made a 49 out of 50, that would be a 98, and they converted all the percentages.
That's actually what all of mine are, the way all of mine are
Yeah,
set
which
up
is
now.
fine, but a lot of times if you just do straight points, then you can use, you don't have to actually do a weight, you can just do a total percentage. If that confuses you, don't worry about it. But because essentially, if you have a possibility of 500 points, say, and each activity gets a chunk of those 500 points, then by default that is weighting those. Each of those is weighted based on how many points you assign to it. Does that make sense? So where the weighting really comes in more is if you like grade everything the same number of points, say 100, which is the same thing as a percentage. But if everything is graded with 100 points, then you need to do the weights to give certain grades more weight than others. But if you're doing actual points, the weight really isn't necessary. Does that make any sense? If it doesn't, it's fine. You're looking puzzled. So let's say,
You know I'm
no,
always
no, it's
puzzled.
fine. So let's say you have, just to make this example easier, you have a total of 100 points possible that somebody could get for your course. So you give them an assignment that's worth 2 points. And you give them another assignment that's worth 10 points. So by default, based on the fact that you're assigning different numbers of points out of total possible points, those are already weighted.
Okay.
Because the one they only get 2 points for, the other one they only get 5
Right.
points for.
Yeah.
So by the same token, if you have those same 2 assignments in a percentage scenario where they got a percentage out of 100 for each of those, and you wanted one of those to count more, since you're grading them both out of 100, like they get 89 for one and a 49 for the other, but you want one of them to carry more weight, then when you set up, that's when we have to set up the weights in Blackboard to tell it, this assignment, we want you to weight the percentage more than this assignment. So anyway, so just as you think about how you're setting it up, if you duplicate it, it's fine. You can set up as points and still have it calculating a weight. It's not going to matter. But it helps me if I think through, is it really necessary to do the weights if you're doing points? So anyway, if I've confused you, just brush it off and we'll get there. All right. And then here is where your category goes. And this is where it's nice if you already have your categories before you start building your assignments, because if you come in here and you haven't, then you have to leave it, or you have to go out and create your category and come back. So this one I'm just going to call it an assignment. All right. And I'm just going to give it 100 points. And then you have your standard things that you have on assignments with your dates. If you want it to only be available at certain times, all your regular options. I'm just going to leave them at default, hit submit. And so you notice it put in the category for me because I did create a column. And this is a manual column, so there's not any activity in Blackboard that they're going to complete that's going to populate that column. But if I do go into my course content, and then I'm going to create an assignment. And since the last one was paper 1, we'll call this one paper 2. I can't type. All right, and then, oops. Screen is small. And I can give it 100 points. Check all those settings. So there's your score. Looking where the category is on here. All right, we're going to submit it. So now if we go back to the grade center, so as you probably discover when you add new things, it just sticks it onto the end. So there's the paper 2 assignment. So when you create an assignment in Blackboard, it's going to automatically create a column for you. And the thing I'm not sure is why it didn't give me the option to set my category from there. Oh, you know, I think it's automatically assigning an assignment to the assignment category. So, but there is a possibility that you would have an assignment that you don't want going in the assignment category, in which case you would need to come to the column in the grade center, click the little arrow to the right. And that's how you edit most of the settings on these columns, is you'll want to click that down arrow to the right and then go to edit column information, and then you can go in there and change the category. See, I'm assuming since I was creating an assignment, it was trying to be helpful and forced it to go into the assignment category. But I can change it to any category that I want. I'm actually going to make paper 2 a test. All right. Do you have any questions or fuzzy areas on that basic creation of categories, creating a manual column, creating, just clicking around.
Yeah.
So now let's take a look at this weighted total column, because this is where you're going to set up your weights so it calculates the grade you want it to. And by default, you have this weighted total column in your grade center, so we'll just use the one they've made by default. And again, I'm clicking on the drop down arrow to the right and going to edit column information. And if we scroll down a little bit, this is where the magic happens, is right here in the weighted grade area. So here's what I was talking about earlier, where you have columns, so you can select an individual column, which is one grade in the grade center, to move over and weight, or you can select an entire category. So this is where if you had made a final and you wanted the final to count a certain percentage, and you could just move the final from the columns to select area over. So I'm gonna, just for this example, take this paper 1, actually paper 2 since I called it test, and bump it over just one column. And then I'll take the category of assignment, which is there, and send it over. So now I've got one column or one grade, one activity that's going to count a percentage, and then I've got a whole category that is going to take the average of those and count it as a percentage. So I'm going to give 20% to that and 80 to that. And it has to equal 100, or it will yell at you when you try to get off the page.
Now, if I'm giving my students multiple attempts at tests, then, but I want it to automatically take their highest score, I do use only the highest value to calculate. Is that right?
Yes, and that I'm pretty sure when you're creating the assignment or the test, that it also has that option in there.
Okay.
To when you give multiple attempts, and it has a little option to check to take the highest.
Okay.
And I think it also gives you a little more control in there, like to average the attempts and that sort of thing. But
Okay.
and also you also always point out, have the options there to drop the highest or lowest grades. I don't know why anybody would drop the highest grade, that just seems mean, but the option is there. But the lowest grade, and I will point out, because this comes up occasionally, if you, before your class starts, like at the beginning of the term, if you set it up and drop the lowest grade, whenever they get that first grade, they're not going to have a grade in the total column in the grade center, because it's going to go ahead and drop it because they only got one grade. So they'll see the grade for the assignment itself, but if you have it calculated into the weighted total column or into the total column, it won't reflect in there because it's excluding it, because it's technically the lowest grade because it's their only grade. So some folks will wait until they are a few grades in before they'll go back in and check that, drop the lowest grade, drop one lowest grade. Does that make sense? And sometimes students will notice it and sometimes they won't. So if you wanted to go ahead and put it in there, it's fine, but just be aware if somebody says, hey, I got a grade for this assignment, but there's nothing in my weighted total or in my total column. That might be why. All right. So we do want to calculate it as a running total. Well, I assume you do. That's generally why we do this. And under the options, include the center and grade center calculations. Just leave that as the default. Generally, it doesn't matter. Actually, it's not going to make any difference unless you're doing some complicated calculations, so just leave that one. Show column to students, that's kind of up to you. Generally, folks do, but if you want to have a column where only you see it and you don't want your students seeing it, you can turn it off to where it's not visible to students. Anyway, and that last one, I don't know anybody who uses it, but should you want to show the statistics, you can turn it on and play around with it. So when I submit that, if I've got my weights set to 100%, it'll show it there. And I'm just gonna see what happens. So paper one would be is my manual column, so I'm gonna give it 100 for that. Now paper two was an actual assignment, but you can still manually enter in just so we get a calculation. I'm gonna put a grade of 85 in there. And so it's weighted my total there. And so this total column is just adding up. It's doing it on a point basis. And that's by default. And we don't have to have that total column. It's just one that they stick in there. And this is where folks have had to learn as we've been using Aviso, which we'll talk about in a minute. Because it wants to make that one your external grade column every time, and it's set to points by default. So anyway, just to let you know that the total column is there by default and is set to points, and that's where it's pulling it from. It's just adding the 185 together. But this weighted total is doing our weights
So if we
based
want
on the
that total
calculation.
column to actually show, like the weighted total is showing, we would set that to percentage?
Yeah, except it's not weighting anything.
Okay, so what then we really need to do is to change our
So-
external grade to the weighted
Yeah,
column?
yeah. So see if I change this to percentage, what it's going to do, and it may, yeah, so what it's doing is it's just showing me the percentage of the 185 points that they have earned. I'm sorry, the percentage of 200 points, because they have a potential of 200 points out of those two assignments. They've earned 185. So that 185 is 92.5% of the 200 potential points that they had.
Okay,
So that's just doing a straight percentage of the possible points they could have earned versus how many they did earn. Whereas, so it's not weighting, it's not assigning more importance to one of those over the other. It's just doing a straight up percentage of the total. So to answer your question, to be able to get an accurate grade for Aviso and an accurate grade for your students to know how they're actually doing, you'll want to use the weighted total. And I know that both of you have your Aviso stuff set up correctly because neither of you are on my naughty list right now. So you probably already know this, but you want to make sure that your total that is showing a percentage and that accurately reflects your student's performance at any given point is set as the external grade. And we do that by clicking, and it may not be named weighted total. You may, some folks create a separate column and do it, but whatever that column is, you want to click the down arrow next to the title of the column and go to set as external grade. Okay, and so now that little green check mark moved over.
I finally learned how to do that.
Good, good. And then, so the mistake we made when we first started with Aviso is we told faculty, and we didn't realize this until it broke, that once you get it set, all you gotta do is copy it the next term and everything will be fine. And that's true as far as the calculations and all, but what's not true is Blackboard doesn't care where that check mark is. When you copy it, it moves it back to the total column. So the one thing that you do have to do every term we found out is go back in and make sure that the green check mark is in the right place for the external grade. But other than that, it should copy forward and work properly. And then what we tell a lot of folks is if this total column isn't anything that you need, isn't useful to you, just go ahead and get rid of it so we don't have a bunch of extra columns in there. So you can just safely delete it if you're not using it. I'll delete that one. So that way you don't have all these different totals that your students are seeing trying to figure out what the heck they mean. Just kind of clean it up. All right. All right, one other thing that I wanted to point out, and again, you have probably seen, but just as a reminder if you haven't, is the column organization. Because as I mentioned, as you add things to Blackboard, add assignments and tests and things, it sticks on the grade column onto the end, and it may not be the order that you want things to go. So if from the Grade Center you go to Manage and Column Organization, it's on this page where you can reorder how your columns appear. I don't have many there, but so what you do is you click on the little cross next to it and you can drag and reorder your columns into whatever order. So top to bottom equates to left to right on the Grade Center. So you can put them in whatever order you like. You can also, just to point out, if you want to, like if I didn't want, for whatever reason, for the students to see a column, you can show and hide the columns in here. So I selected a check mark next to that if I wanted to hide it. And then I go up to where it says show hide and I can select. Actually, this doesn't, I misspoke, this doesn't hide it from your students. You do that when you set it up. This will actually hide it from your Grade Center when you go to view it. So if there are columns, like some folks don't want to see the student ID and all those things because it doesn't mean anything to them and it just gives them less room on the Grade Center. So you could, if you don't want to see it, you can check that and then hide it. And then when I go back to my Grade Center, oh, you have to submit it. And then go back to Grade Center. And we no longer see the student ID. So you could clean that up. Same with the username. If you don't need to see it, you can hide it. And this just hides it from your view. It doesn't change anything that your students see. And again, that was in Manage Column Organization. All right, so we looked at, we talked about categories and how it's a good idea to plan those out before you start if you can. If not, you can always go back and add those categories. And we looked at creating custom categories and then building a weighted total based on either individual columns or on categories. And we looked at setting up your Aviso column properly and having it set to a percentage, and then organizing your Grade Center sort of how you want it to be laid out for viewing.